without further ado, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Bruce Charnov. Bruce, of course, has been a staple of our session. He was he founded, basically helped us found our history committee early on, and he has been a member of our committee and the chairman of this session for the longest time. It's very hard to fill his shoes. He's been a fantastic session organizer, and we always welcome him here with all his great papers and presentation. He has won at least 3 Best Paper Awards in our sessions, and his background is just without question. I would like to give him enough time on the floor to talk about his paper, The Mysterious Death of Harold Pitcairn. We might have some revelations here today, so without further ado, Dr. Charnov, I'll give you the floor, and I'm going to shut off my camera here, sir.
This is, I'm Bruce Charnov, and this is my 17th paper, or my 18th paper in 17 years. But it's different from any paper that I've given before, because before I've written about history, this paper is going to make history. We're going to change the history books. We're going to solve the mystery of the death of Harold Pitcairn. We're going to solve it 60 years after it happened, and we're going to solve it by looking at clues that were either missed or deliberately ignored or distorted. So let's get to it. Let's solve this mystery. This was the headline on April 24th, 1960. Harold Pitcairn, in the New York Times. Harold Pitcairn takes life at 62, plane and autogyro pioneer, shoots himself at home in the Philadelphia suburb. We're going to solve the mystery of that death because it's been obscured by history deliberately or inadvertently ever since. I show you his tombstone because of the New York Times article the next day. Some history books talk about him dying on April 24th. He actually died on the evening of April 23rd. As we're going to see, one of the clues ignored by history is not April 23rd, but what happened the day before. It's been totally ignored by history. We're going to solve that mystery. John Pitcairn Jr. was a Pennsylvania industrialist. He was a follower of Emanuel Swedenborg, became the major financial benefactor of the New Church of Jerusalem, which was the church founded based on the writings of Swedenborg. At this point, he made his first fortune in railroads and as an industrialist. But at this point, we're going to talk about him. He is one of the co-founders of Pittsburgh Plate Glass. He is a very, very wealthy man. He had 3 sons. We're interested in the oldest, Raymond, and the youngest, Harold. Harold is 12 years younger. And history has ignored their relationship. But we're going to see is seminal to understanding what happened in 1960, the night that Pitcairn died. Raymond was his favorite, possibly because he was the oldest. He was 12 years older than Harold. Raymond, and we see this because Raymond had a bad reaction to a vaccine. So his father became the major financial supporter and one of the founders of the anti-vaccination movement in America. This is a pamphlet that John Pitcairn published. He also provided the financial backing for the anti-vaccination in America. That all comes about because of his relationship and his closeness with his son Raymond. That will become important later. Here's a picture of Harold and Theodore. I didn't want to ignore the middle son. I show you his picture. Theodore is on the right. He's a little bit older. Theodore drops out of our picture because he becomes a minister in the church, the New Church of the New Church, and it pursues a pastoral, ecclesiastical career. He doesn't figure in this, but the youngest son Harold does. Also ignored by a crucial clue ignored by history has been the fact that Harold became interested in aviation, and he learned to fly at the Curtis Flying School. Because he had a pilot's license, the Army Air Corps recruited him in 1916. At this point, he's 19, recruited him as an air cadet. And history has forgotten that Harold had military training. And that's going to become terribly significant to understanding what happened, and perhaps understanding why what I call the official explanation of his death doesn't work. This is a picture of Harold in his air cadet uniform. This is a few months before his father dies and he ends up coming home. In 1916, Raymond was 31. He had, as you can see, 3 children. He's pictured here with his father, John Pitcairn, on the right, a few months before John Pitcairn's death. When John Pitcairn dies, Raymond assumes leadership of the family, and he will dominate his brother, Harold, for the rest of his life. Not so much Raymond. Raymond goes off to become a minister. Raymond Pitcairn tells his brother, "You've got to end this aviation nonsense," and he gets him to go to business school. He goes to Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania. The business training will serve Harold very well, but what we're interested in is the dominant position that Raymond will exercise over his brother for the rest of his life. Now, this is 1916. John Pitcairn is a trained lawyer. I'm sorry, not John. Raymond is a trained lawyer. But for the last 3 years, he's been he helped design and supervise the construction of the Bryn Athyn Cathedral, which is the cathedral of the new church. It will be completed in another 3 years. He's a self-taught architect, but will be recognized as pretty good at what he does. This is Raymond looking at a design model of the new church, of the cathedral in Bryn Athyn. And they use this model to look at how the buildings would work together, how the light would fall on them. Let's look at how it actually turned out. This is what it looks like. It's a magnificent building, magnificent construction, been recognized in many historic registers. Raymond also designed Caronwood, his home. Today it's a museum, which is also recognized as a masterful construction. He is certainly a man of many achievements. At his father's death, he becomes, he will be the chairman of the board of Pittsburgh Plate Glass and of many, many companies. The company owns many companies. By 1960, and this is the celebration of his 75th birthday, his achievements are recognized. Raymond is on the left. Perhaps you can recognize President and Mrs. Eisenhower. They are close personal friends. They visit Caronwood many times for holiday stays. By 1960, Raymond is 75 years old, and on the evening of April 23rd, we're going to celebrate his 75th birthday and all of his achievements. By 1960, however, Harold's achievements have largely been forgotten. The fact that he created Pittsburgh Aircraft, which was sold to Chandler Keyes in 1929, renamed Eastern Air Transport. This is the Pitcairn Mail Wing in the Smithsonian, and that 10 years later is renamed Eastern Airlines. His role in the founding of Eastern Airlines has been forgotten. His triumphs of the autogyro have also been forgotten because they've passed. This is his PCA-2 flying a certification flight over Manhattan through what I was told by an architect is the airspace of one of the World Trade Centers. The greatest achievement of his life is on April 22nd, 1930, where he's receiving the Collier Trophy for the greatest achievement in aviation, the 1930 Collier Trophy, presented by President Herbert Hoover, who has asked that they land an autogyro on the back lawn. It's the first rotary wing aircraft to land in the White House, obviously not the last. You see on the left-hand side the large Collier Trophy. Keep that in mind. We're going to come back to it. His greatest autogyro achievement by 1968 had also been forgotten. This is the PCA, or the PA-36 autogyro, all aluminum, capable of jump takeoffs, the most beautiful, capable autogyro ever built. And in early 1943, it is cut up for scrap, shocking Pitcairn's associates. He orders it cut up for aluminum scrap drive. It was the end of his autogyro adventure. By 1960, Pitcairn's autogyro achievements lay in ruin, much as the first autogyro to fly in America, the Sierra C8W, lay in ruins and still lies in ruins. It's never been restored. This is it at the Garber Center in the Paul Garber Center in Silver Hill. It deserves to be restored, but it is an apt metaphor for Harold Pitcairn's autogyro achievements in 1960. All that remained of Pitcairn's autogyro achievements was a patent lawsuit against the United States of America, filed in 1951. The United States had indemnified the helicopter companies against patent infringement suits by Pitcairn. Pitcairn later would say that if I knew I would have to sue my own government, I never would have gone into the autogyro business. But sue them, he did. And it's crucial to us to understand what was the status of the autogyro lawsuit in 1960 on the eve of his death. It is not as it has been portrayed in the literature. Now, the first explanation of his death actually comes in the 1978 book by Catherine O'Brien. Largely has been ignored by history, primarily because it concerns Lake George, where the Pitcairns had a summer estate, and because it's filled with errors. It's got many salacious details about the Pitcairns, and it also gets a lot of the details of the death wrong. But we need to look at it because it's the first explanation given. After Pitcairn's death, his wife said Clara said she never wanted to hear anything more about it. And basically, the literature is silent until Catherine O'Brien's book. Pitcairn's friends say that Harold Pitcairn habitually carried a pistol in the inside pocket of his coat when he conducted his nightly rounds, checking the doors and windows of the mansion. The pistol, ready for instant action, had a hair trigger. The pocket in which he kept the pistol also contained a notebook in which he wrote down a record of his engagements and future activities. That notebook contained a list of plans projected for the next 5 days. It isn't logical, insist these friends, that a man would list his commitments for 5 days if he intended to end his life. Now, she clearly has interviewed, and that is the local story. But as we're going to see, and I just draw your attention to it, we've got an immediate problem with this explanation. Pitcairn had carried, as we're going to see, a 1907 .32 caliber Savage pistol, revolver, well, it's an automatic, with him since the Lindbergh kidnapping in 1932. Is it logical that a man who had military small arms training, go back to him being an Army Air Cadet, would carry a hair trigger pistol for 28 years and not know that it had a hair trigger, or in fact carry because it would not have been safe? Problem number one. Pitcairn's friends theorized, these are quotes from her book, he had either placed the gun on his desk or that it had fallen from his pocket. In the first instance, an accidental movement of his arm could have caused the hair trigger to go off. In the second instance, the sudden jar of the fall could have had the same effect. It was evident that the bullet had struck the ceiling, then his hand, and was deflected through an eye, because that's where the fatal injury was, through one of his eyes. As I point out, there are, this facile explanation immediately has some fatal flaws. He's an experienced military trainee who, why would he carry a hair trigger around in his pocket for 28 years? The described bullet trajectory borders on the fanciful, if not actually being in the realm of the fantastic. And the fact that he carries a list of future engagements does not account for decision made in an immediate moment. It's also very curious that she would assert that he was carrying a list of future engagements in what was formal wear, because he'd just come from celebrating his brother's 75th birthday, where he was the MC and there were 450 guests. But this explanation does not maintain for very long, because in 1981, the Harold F. Pitcairn story, The Legacy of Wings by Frank Kingston Smith, is published. And that becomes the official explanation. Now, I don't know that, in fact, this was not a response to Catherine O'Brien's, but there's no evidence that Frank Kingston Smith knew of the O'Brien book. But he did consult, and he thanks and he acknowledges consultation with Carl Gunther. Carl Gunther is the Pitcairn archivist, longtime friend, and historian. Legacy of Wings is a subsidized publication. They actually paid him to write it, and they paid for its publication. The Pitcairn family, the records of which you'll find in the Smithsonian. So let's look at what is the official explanation, and which has stood now ever since 1981. until today. This is what Franks Kingston Smith offered. Police investigation disclosed that 2 shots had been fired. One had penetrated the ceiling directly over the desk in the first floor study. Another had struck Pitcairn in the eye. The next morning, it was discovered that the semi-automatic pistol was defective. When cocked, it had a super-sensitive hair trigger and had a faulty disconnector so that it would fire more than 1 shot at a time, a condition known as doubling. None of this information ever came out. The night reporter who telephoned the wire services of several major newspapers omitted the most important word in the coroner's report, accidental. So the next morning's headlines reported Pitcairn's death merely as a suicide, yet there was no note, no indication of depression or unhappiness. It is obvious with decades of scrutiny that this doesn't work. The taxonomy and the timeline don't work. Accidental suicide is not a forensic conclusion. Either a death is accidental or suicide. It cannot be both. Secondly, the coroner's report would not have been issued the night of the death, April 23rd, 1960. At best, only a preliminary opinion may have been expressed en passant. So there couldn't have been a report distorted by the AP wire services, which reported an accidental suicide. Finally, the timeline doesn't work, as any judgment of accidental death would not have been rendered until the next day, when the supposedly defective Savage 1907 .32 caliber pistol was examined, hours after the night reporter's call to the Associated Press wire service. By the way, the New York Times was not the only paper that carried the suicide report. It was also carried by many local papers in Pennsylvania. Now, the issue with the faulty gun, this isn't the gun, but this is what it looks like. It's the Savage 1907 .32 caliber pistol. Savage pistols are among the best designed and most highly crafted pistols ever made in the United States. They may be fired safely, and they are recognized as excellent self-defense weapons still available at modest prices in gun shops. This is by the sumptuously published, incredibly exhaustively referenced book by Bailey Brower Jr. He is the historian. He told me that he knows of no instance of a hair trigger or no instance of doubling with this pistol in its history. Additionally, it's most curious that even after the faulty gun discovery, Pitcairn's friends made no effort in any newspaper, any publication, to correct the record. And it's possible that this was in response to Clara Pitcairn, his wife's request that she never wanted to hear about it again, but it is curious. Kingston Smith also found that his official explanation on the observation, there was no note, no indication or depression of unhappiness. But this makes much of little, potentially misunderstands contemporaneous observations, and most importantly, ignores historical facts, whether innocently or with intent. But with the clarity of 6 decades, this can't stand, but must be brought to bear upon the mystery of the death of this largely forgotten aviation pioneer. Here are the factors that were missed: his relationship with his older brother, the significance of the day before his death, and his state of mind vis-a-vis the patent infringement lawsuit in April 1960. None of these were considered at the time, but each yields valuable insight into the tragic events on that day. We've already seen that this was Raymond Pitcairn's 75th birthday. It was celebrating his life. He had dominated his brother, whom he'd urged to stop this aviation nonsense. Pitcairn's achievements lay in ruin, but he was celebrating his brother. The greatest indicators, this forgotten significance of April 22nd. Pitcairn sat in his study preparing to host the gala. He assembled all of the telegrams, of congratulatory and celebratory telegrams. But it is impossible to believe that he wasn't thinking of another April 22nd, 29 years earlier, which was the high point of his aviation life, the high point of his life, when he stood in the back of the White House and received the Collier Trophy. Also, while working at his desk, he could look over and see the miniature Collier Trophy that he was personally awarded. I showed you the big one that's in the Smithsonian. He had a small copy of it. All of his associates received it. This was in his study to remind him. You can see here the big trophy in the background. This is another award ceremony, but all the recipients get little ones. This is what he could see. He was thinking of his achievements, which now lay in ruin. The patent lawsuit was far from finished. It had been going on for 9 years. As I point out, it would be it would consume 46 months to determine liability, 186 court sessions, 14 expert witnesses. Some would be in court for months, over 1,000 exhibits, a transcript that would yield almost 15,000 pages, a commissioner who would take 4 years to render judgment, and required an additional 4,000 pages of legal briefs. The suit was not going anywhere. Now, maybe because I started asking questions about this to Carl Gunther and to Steve Pitcairn, and all they told me was, go read the book, go read the Frank Kingston Smith book. Carl Gunther in 2009 published a second explanation. He's talking to the police chief who shows him the gun and says it's got a hair trigger. Well, you see, this weapon has a hair trigger, the police chief continued. We knew it was Mr. Pitcairn's custom to carry the pistol over his right shoulder as he made rounds of the housing, checking doors and windows. We think he got back to his office, sat down, plunked his elbows down on the desk. The gun went off, sending the first shot into the ceiling. It also startled him, causing his arm muscles tense enough to turn the barrel of the gun towards himself when the second shot fired, entering his head and killing him. And Gunther then goes on to say, I knew, given his spiritual beliefs, he wasn't the kind of person who would violate his deep spiritual convictions. Now that's new. So what are the problems with this reboot of the official explanation? First of all, it flows from a conversation allegedly almost 50 years earlier. Secondly, it assumes a position of carrying a gun over a right shoulder, which no one in their right mind would ever carry a pistol over the right shoulder, particularly someone trained by the Army Air Corps. Bailey Brower, in looking at this over, claims that the only account for a shot in the eye was that it was self-inflicted, there being no natural way for it to occur. Let's come to a better explanation of all of this. Now, I sent this for review to eminent aviation historian and West Point graduate, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Fardink. This is his analysis, and I believe, and I advance this as the official analysis. Harold, and I got to read it to you. Harold was described that evening as particularly jovial and notably gay mood. He was typically described normally quiet, diffident, and reserved, but in performing his duties, he was almost ebullient and made humorous remarks, frequently bringing down the house. Honors and celebratory telegrams arrived from dignitaries. I'm going to skip. Many toasts had caused him to obviously consume alcohol, liquid courage for a normally quiet person. How many times have we seen this happen to others? Now let's look at Fardink's explanation. First, look at Pitcairn's Savage model 1907. It's a small pistol. It fires what was considered a fairly potent round. He cradles the pistol with the barrel pointing at him by wrapping his right hand around the butt, placed his thumb inside the trigger guard. His left hand offers support beneath his right hand, while in this position he points the end of the barrel at his right eye. We should note that the action of alcohol is biphasic. When he was sitting at that desk, he was now depressed. He's about to do something he would otherwise never do in a normal day. Studies have shown that chemical imbalance in the brain is a leading cause of suicide. He pulls the trigger with his thumb. It pushes it away. That accounts for the second shot. The official police report, the investigation scenarios make no sense to me. I spent 24 years in the Army, qualifying annually as an expert with the pistols and revolvers that pilots were required to carry. I still shoot regularly. I feel that I do know something about these weapons. And it is his judgment that Pitcairn most likely committed suicide. And as to his spirituality, he was a devout member of the new church. The founder, Emanuel Swedenborg, does not talk about suicide that often, but he would not agree with doctrines that say that suicides go to hell by default. Your place in the afterlife is not determined by one action, but by how you've lived your life and whether love guides you. As a scientist, he would also understand that chemical imbalances can be responsible for suicide thoughts. Give me 30 seconds to tell you what happened. Pitcairn's estate in 1976, or 1966, or 1967, almost 7 years afterwards his death, was awarded almost over $500 million in damages. That would go on for another 9 years in appeal. It eventually, in 1976 or 1977, Pitcairn's estate was awarded just under $250 million, the largest patent judgment against the United States government. Frank Kingston Smith would say that the highest court in the land has declared as a matter of fact and law that Harold Pitcairn had founded Eastern Airlines, had also founded America's rotary wing industry. At last, justice had prevailed. Not true. The Supreme Court did not declare any of that. They simply awarded money. However, in 1995, Harold Pitcairn was finally elected to membership in the National Aviation Hall of Fame. And there, his achievements at Eastern Airlines and with the autogyro finally were recognized. It is a wonderful recognition, made even better and more significant when you realize the tragedy that occurred on that night in 1960 in April, when I believe Harold Pitcairn killed himself. Thank you.